Greetings, everyone. I'm Mar. Once again, this is my opinion. Now we are in episode 4 of the John Adams miniseries Reunion. About give or take the halfway mark. Since there's 7 episodes, it's kind of hard to give it a direct halfway mark, but screw it, we'll say this is now halfway through the series. The revolution is over. Now we're going to have to deal with the aftermath and the lead-in to the ratifying of the Constitution. And as such, this goes from the ending parts of the revolution in to the very beginning of our current republic. And like I mentioned in the previous review, no mention of the Articles of Confederation at all. Not even in dialogue that involves Jefferson, which you'd think it would have been brought up in. But, you know, maybe they didn't want to bog down with too much exposition there. Especially since the one that they use is setting the stage for later parts in the timeline. Now, it picks up right after the previous episode. Adams is a little bit better, no longer coughing, he's gotten American credit established, but now he's wondering, what am I going to do? Well, the Congress has decided he is going to be America's first representative to the court of George III. Which is like, really? It's one of those things where you're like, wow, that's interesting. But it's a good choice. I mean, he's going to be direct, and he can be polite when he needs to be. And in a situation like this, he's probably not going to be too overly rude since they've achieved independence. So he'll be blunt when he has to be, but he'll more than likely just be civil. And he did serve as the representative from April of 1785 to February of 1788, so a 3-year one. And we do kind of get an implication of why in the show. I have to actually look up how historically accurate this is. But for the purpose of the show, it's because there's a lot of tension in the air, and you can tell they're not wanted. Now, before they go and meet George III, John is reunited with Abigail. And this scene, there is a tension in the air throughout it. You're just wondering what type of tension. Is she still mad at the fact he had to leave and they've been separated again? She doesn't like the fact that she has to come overseas now. There's a combination of all that. And it is a little bit of that, but it's mainly sexual tension. And this leads into a sex scene for the reunion. Now, the fun thing about this, and this is according to Paul Giamatti in an interview he gave to Dave Davies, that sex scene was not in the script. The script called for them to kiss, you know, their first time actually touching each other. But he and Laura went over it, discussing what they think their characters would do in that situation. And they decided, you know what, maybe we should keep going in this scene. And they hoped that the director and the camera people would just be like, no, okay, roll with it. And they did. But what we see in the final cut is edited down from what they shot. And the whole scene was improvised. And it definitely feels like it, which helps the scene because it definitely feels like two lovers that have been apart for a while. I mean, they're familiar with one another, but they're trying to get reacquainted with one another. So there's a little bit of awkwardness there, but it's brought about by the tension, the longing, and a bunch of other mixed emotions that is released in their lovemaking. And I can just imagine what the director and the camera people were thinking, like, this wasn't in the script. We do just keep going. It's like, oh, this is beautiful. Oh, this is beautiful. This is gonna make the episode. Oh, you're geniuses. Nice little bit of improv. And there's also tension in the scene where we get to see George III, who is played by Tom Hollander, who, of course, at around the same time also played Cutter Beckett in Pirates 2 and 3. There he's more of a straight up villain. Here there's like a slight awkwardness with him, but I'm guessing it's Tom going for that he did not want the separation, as he makes clear in dialogue. He's trying to be civil and not come across as too arrogant, especially since it's the first time he's meeting a representative from the new United States of America. He doesn't want to be too bitter. And he's a little surprised by the person who he's meeting in front of him, because he's probably heard about John Adams. He's probably like, this guy's very brash. And he's like, this guy's very restrained. And a lot of the dialogue that they have in this scene is taken verbatim from what's historically recorded that they said to one another. And I have some of it written down right here. Let me just find where I have it in the notes real quick. Oh yeah, here it is. That meeting happened on June 1st. It was a respectful exchange. And, of course, there is that respectful tension in that scene. That's what I put it as, a respectful tension. And this is what they were talking about later in the scene when the king brings up, compared to your constituents, I hear that you're not enamored with France. And this is the exchange. That opinion, sir, is not mistaken. I must avow to your majesty, I have no attachments to but my own country. And the king said in return, an honest man will never have any other. And the way they say it in the episode does go with that whole respectful tension. They're trying to be respectful with one another, but there's still that tension because this is the first meeting. War just ended. They didn't want the separation. And on John's side, he is one of the people who signed his name to that document that they sent to the king when they declared independence. So the king is probably trying to gauge him in the scene, like, what type of man is this John Adams? I've heard about him, but I want to get a gauge. And he's probably a little pleasantly surprised by him. He's like, he's brash, but I can see he can be respectful when it calls for it. And of course, following the scenes that we see after this of them, the Adamses in England, which leads to the whole thing. You've seen some of the clips where he's like pitifully embarrassed. He comes home just in time for the new country to be made. We have a reunion scene involving their children who are grown up by this time. And in this regard, John Quincy from this episode on is going to be played by Eben Moss Bacharach. He does a pretty good job. They do age him with makeup like the others as it goes along. Here's where he looks the youngest. He does a pretty good job. You can definitely tell he's their son, but he's a little more, I'm trying to find the right word, relaxed, I guess you could say, compared to his dad. Not as over the top. John can be theatrical, whereas he's a little bit more restrained. And the one scene that you can really tell the differences in their characters is when John's giving him the dad talk after they find out that Quincy is courting a 15-year-old, which I know in a modern perspective, that's a what? But this is one of those things we got to put that modern sensibility a little to the side and look at it in the historical lens. It would have been a bit more common back then. However, I believe at this point, John Quincy would probably be in his early 20s, give or take. I didn't put it in the notes, but I'm guessing around 22-ish. So a little bit older. I mean, there was that 10-year age difference between John and Abigail, but Abigail was of age in her 20s when they married, if I'm looking at everything right. And Quincy is not yet fully established, so there's that little worry there. And also, this is the first time of them hearing of it. He's been courting her a year. And they just got back, like, really? You've been talking with her and you haven't said anything to us? And of course, they both disagree, so John talks him out of it. Now, this scene can go with two things. One, he's trying to get him to break it off with her for his own good. And in return, he's going to give him his own practice and a 100-pound stipend. Now, the other thing could be is if he's actually testing to see if Quincy actually does truly love this woman. Because if he did love her, he'd say hell no to the money and probably do it. And if that was the case, he'd probably still give him the other thing, but it's just a test of his son's love and also a little bit of his character. Either way, you could say it's not really a pass or fail. It's just a check to see if he truly does love this girl after a year like that, or if it's just still, testing the waters, putting his bait out and see what bites. And the fact that he says, I'll take the money and break it off, like, alright, there really wasn't anything there. No harm, no foul. They do gloss over the Constitutional Convention near the end of this episode. I don't remember offhand if John went, but the way that this episode is shot and edited implies he didn't, which if he did go, that's a big disservice right there. But considering they have to jump forward in time, I can kind of see why they would do it, especially since it paints John in a little bit better light, that he just wants to go home, be a simple farmer, and like Washington, he only comes out because he's called to service, and also it rubs his ego a little bit that he wants to do it. I mean, Abigail even has a line where she says, vice president at least, anything else would be beneath you, which I kind of get it, but it's like, being a senator would not be beneath him. Being a chief justice would not have been beneath him. I mean, he's a lawyer. I mean, being the first chief justice of the United States was quite an honor. Of course, back then the Supreme Court at first did not have as much power as it does now, but that's one of those things you gotta establish through precedent. Of course, he is elected the first vice president. And we see a little bit of John's temper come in again when he's mad at how many electoral votes he got, and Abigail has to put him straight. It's like, hey, you might have gotten second place, but you're the first vice president, and look, you still got more votes than every other person on this list combined. That says something right there. It kind of does. It also makes you wonder how many of those votes would have gone to John if there were less people on there, like if there was only 3 people running. Like, how many of those would have gone? Maybe John wouldn't have won, but it's one of those things, like, yeah. And it kind of goes with his later view to use the line that he was obnoxious, and just, like, based on that, it's like, it's no slight. You still got more votes. It's just, you have a bunch of people on the ballot, people are going to vote for other people. That's just how it is. I mean, even now, part of the reason I think that the main 2 parties stay in power, even with the other ones. I mean, some people are going to vote for the other ones, but then there's a whole thing about some of those votes diverted could have made that party win in that election, and then switch it and vice versa. It's all BS and it's bad for you, as George Carlin once said. Now, the last scene in the episode is George Washington's inauguration. And like in the previous episode, Morse plays Washington with a humble dignity. So that you can tell he'd rather be in retirement, especially with how they make him up. You know, he's very gray, looks very old. Well, compared to how we saw him last. But he's doing that because, as he put it before, if they want me to, I will do my duty. And that's what we get out of him in this episode. He goes and does his duty. And this inauguration scene, it is a good example of using technology, especially CG technology, right. Because that whole scene of all the cheering crowd, that is all created in post. They would take takes of at least 80 extras, a few seconds, flip them, phone around, okay, you say that flag and all that, shoot, till they had enough to do the coverage, and then just did that shot in post. Perfect. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Nice way to use all that. And of course, a little added touch we really wouldn't notice unless you're really looking up, and it's more of a subtle thing, but it's a nice little attention to detail, is that every extra in that crowd had their teeth painted with a fast drying saliva-proof gunk paint in order to, go with the whole dental practice at the time. The working class characters had worse looking smiles than, say, the upper crust characters, and it works there. And that scene, it really does show just how humble Washington is supposed to be, or at least how he's being portrayed. That he's very soft-spoken, that they have to strain to even hear him do the oath of office. Of course, that could also tie into the fact he's tired, but he's still doing his duty. And of course, I like at the end, once he's sworn in, he does even call Mr. Adams over to stand with him and look over at the crowd. Showing that, even if they have some disagreements on certain aspects of it, like Adams' whole thing about what to call the president, which they will bring up in the next episode as a little jolty gag, that, they will work together. It's like, I'm the president, you are the vice president, we will work for the people. Nice little way to end this episode. Jefferson we mainly see in the scenes set in France in the early part of the episode before Abigail and John go to Britain. And he has a little nice back and forth with the two of them. You can tell he's friendly with both of them. He's going to miss both of them. But we get to see the beginning of the discontent that happened between John and Tom in their later years, that would lead to their estrangement before their last years, where they wrote letters to one another. Which, one thing I remember with that episode is how they get those letters in. Perfect way to get them in, but I'll talk about that when we get to that final episode. Here it's mainly them talking about the Constitution and all that. Jefferson has a pretty good line about the world belongs exclusively to the living, which is something to think about. It's like, Constitution was written back in the late 1700s, and other than the amendments that have happened since then, not a lot of it's changed as the wording. I mean, certain parts of it have been interpreted differently by different Supreme Courts, depending on what the issue is at hand. But it's one of those things that it hasn't changed a lot, so it's like, makes you think on that. It's like, why would that generation have to bind this current generation and the ones that are still living from before and the ones coming after to that? That's Jefferson's whole thing there. And he has a pretty good point there. But that's also why, as an aside, a lot of people view the Constitution as a living, breathing document. That some of the stuff in there is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, freedom of the press, freedom of all that, Congress cannot do anything. Which, of course, even nowadays is kind of sad because some people seem to have it in their head that the censorship of social media and other things is a violation of the First Amendment when technically it's not. Unless the government bought one of them, that would be different because then it's like, yeah. But I know I'm getting a little bit off topic with that, but that's part tying into the whole thing there is that the difference of an opinion is what it is. And it can be summed up in one thing that ties into a little bit of dialogue they have, and that is that the difference in the amount of faith you have in your fellow man. Which, of course, this even goes back to the philosophers that inspired the framers when they were writing the Declaration and later the Constitution. It's too little faith in your fellow man and too much faith in your fellow man. I go more in the middle. You have to have faith in your fellow man, but you can't have too much. You got to find the right balance, and it's going to be very situational. It's not a black and white thing, it's a gray area thing. And it's interesting to see these two. They're doing friendly arguments, but it's going to be interesting to see how this little minor, for this point, difference of political philosophy and opinion is going to change in the next couple episodes, especially once John in the series is going to be president, because that's when things are really going to be interesting to look at. If you are familiar with the Alien and Sedition Acts, you know what I'm talking about. There's going to be one little interesting thing to talk about there because of something I learned recently when I took political science. I'm going to have to look up that just to get a little bit more interesting info for this series. Oh no, this is another good episode. Nice little segue from the last one. Leading in further from the end of the Revolution right into the beginning of our modern republic. Nice way there. Last time we get to see Benjamin Franklin in an episode. And of course he goes out, talking about like the only thing he's going to contribute to the Constitution is its prose, which is like, who else but Benji? And of course, Godspeed there. Like the previous episode, there could have been some more scenes in a couple spots, and they could have brought up the Articles of Confederation in dialogue, like I mentioned before. But I can understand why they probably didn't do either of those. Probably wanted to make sure that the timeline went ahead smoothly, didn't feel like it would go a little forward, stop, go a little forward, stop, just go from one. More so for pacing reasons and also to make the story feel like it's not super bogged down. And the articles probably would have caused more exposition in certain scenes, make them drag on a bit longer. Probably would have made it almost impossible to not have a political debate in a couple scenes, more than they already had, which was friendly debate. And also, if they're not going to bring up the articles before, why would they bring them up again later? You don't really need to, but from a history buff standpoint, it's like, I really wish they had. It would have been nice to hear them mention them at least. And of course, this is where we get to see both costume and makeup being used to show the passage of time, because fashion-wise, the previous episodes, there really wasn't that much difference. At least historically space-wise. There might have been subtle differences from the beginning of the first episode to like the middle part of the last episode, since the whole decade had passed, and then fashion start to change a bit. But it's here where you start to notice it a bit more, and you also notice makeup and all that, especially on Abigail and John, since we've been following them from the beginning. Obviously with Washington it is, because he's older too, but we haven't seen him, so it's a bit more like jump. But with John and Abigail, it's like, ooh, she's a bit grayer. Oh, we're starting to see him. He's actually growing his hair out a bit this time instead of having to rely on the wig. Definitely looking a bit more gray in the face. Obviously, the children are older, so they're played by different actors now, so there's that. But it's a nice little way, and it's something that we're going to continue to see in the next couple episodes as we go further into the timeline, into the time period where Jefferson and Adams left this mortal coil. And the next episode is going to deal with Washington's presidency. John feeling a bit useless in his role as vice president, and of course some of the politics involving the era, especially since it's going to be the era of the French Revolution. It's going to be a moment where I'm going to be able to bring out some of my political science learnings, and also we get to see the ending where John Adams is finally elected president. The first one-term president. Till next time, guys.